So welcome to the first in our live webinars through Legal Lifelines, and this is going to be on stop and search. We're going to begin with a video, and then I'll introduce you to our amazing panel that you can hopefully see and we'll hear from in due course.
Telling me that I look suspicious, and because of the area of drug problems. You detain me because of what? Because of perception? Because you perceive me to be something I'm not?
So you've just been putting cuffs on the street for no reason.
Please tell him what you've handcuffed him for. Why do you think I'm going to be violent?
There we go, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you could hear and see what we just witnessed, which was the promotional video for this webinar that you're all welcome to be a part of. And thank you for joining us on a Saturday. I appreciate, you know, a lot of people have things to do, and it's a testament to the importance of this unbelievably important issue that people are giving up their Saturdays to listen from our community leaders and from our legal leaders, and to get the advice they need live and direct. And I thank you for your time, and I thank the panel who have joined us to bring you this webinar. I also have to thank our sponsors, London Rock Group Limited. They've kindly allowed Legal Lifelines to bring this webinar to you. Now, in this webinar, we are going to go through the history of stop and search. We're going to get a bit of background about how we've come to a situation and the intergenerational issues that's blighted the community, and why we're still seeing such unbelievably disproportionate numbers of people getting stopped and searched from certain communities. We're then going to go on to look at some of the issues around policing, and we're going to hear from a lived experience from one of our panelists who you saw feature in the video that just hit your screens, about what happened to him and how that's impacted on his life and other people that he knows in the community. We're also going to hear from a former police officer who now works as an outreach worker, who I'm going to introduce you to fully in due course, about her experience of interacting with the community, both in uniform and now without a uniform. The difference with this webinar is what we're going to do, community, is we're going to hear from our community leaders, and then we're just going to examine all the issues from all the angles. We're going to talk about solutions, because I think we've all had enough. And thankfully, we think that we have got solutions for you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your time. And we're going to do our best to make it worth your while. So I'm going to introduce our panel properly now. And we've got Joe Sidhu, Queen's Counsel. Joe is one of the most eminent barristers, lawyers this country has. And for those of you that aren't in the legal profession, when you hear Queen's Counsel, that is a sign of the highest accolade that you can get as a lawyer, and it means that he's achieved everything that you can do in the legal profession, and he's brilliant at what he does. Not only is he Queen's Counsel, but he's Vice Chair of the Criminal Bar Association, which is the organisation that looks after all the criminal barristers in the United Kingdom. So it's a great honour and pleasure to have you, Joe, and thank you very much. We also have Dorris Jessett, who I mentioned before, who's the former police officer and now outreach worker, and I'll get into her profile a little bit more a bit later, but welcome, Dorris, and thank you for your time. We also have Dr. Rita Dalton Harrison, who's a leading academic and a senior lecturer in law and criminology at Royal Holloway, University London. And she's going to be enlightening us in due course about her part of this presentation. And we also have Abby Johnson, who's a legal gem and leading barrister in the UK. And there's loads I'm going to say about her, but I'm going to re-brief you just before she gives her incredible part of the lecture about the law. And we also have Sayce Holmes-Lewis, who many of you will be familiar with, who's one of the leading figures in the community and has done so much to give back to the community in London, and was also, unfortunately, a recipient of a very high-profile stop and search, which many of you may have seen go viral earlier this year. And as an introduction myself, I'm Michael Herford, founder of Legal Lifelines, and I'm a solicitor specialising in crime. And I hope that we can all go for a journey today, learn a lot together, and walk away with some meaningful, tangible solutions together. So I'm going to hand over to Jo now, who's going to give us some background into stop and search and where we are and how we've come to this position today.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure to appear on a panel with such esteemed and informed colleagues, each of whom brings a different perspective to this important conversation that we're having this afternoon. And may I pay tribute, Michael, to the efforts that you've made behind the scenes to ensure that we're able to launch this particular webinar to address this very vexed issue, which is causing so much angst and worry and fear within our community. Michael, as you have kindly introduced me, I am a specialist in criminal defense work, and I've been doing that for some 27 years. And so my own journey as somebody at the bar means that I have interacted with a vast number of people who have been brought into the criminal justice system, many of whom have experienced the indignity of being stopped and searched, many of whom have been stopped and searched without good reason. Our system of justice in this country and indeed across the world can only survive if it has the trust of the community and those who are charged with the responsibility of enforcing the law. When that trust breaks down, that's when the problems within society, which may be lurking underneath, will then surface and sometimes explode. In order, therefore, to make sure that our communities feel safe and that they are treated properly and with respect, it is essential that the police do their job properly and do not exceed the powers that they are given by Parliament. Michael, stop and search is really just the beginning of a journey or a pipeline for an individual who may end up in the criminal justice system. But we know, of course, that stop and search is not a power that is used fairly in many instances, and particularly in our cities, where we have large communities of Black and brown people. When I was a young man, I was stopped and searched when I was still a student at university. And I recall vividly that when I was pulled up by the police late at night, a car drawing up next to me, and me holding a bag full of books and files, wondering why it was that I was being approached by 3 police officers. And I know how afraid I felt in that moment, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. And to be asked by those officers what I had in my bag and where I had been, I had at least enough courage to say to them, "Why are you asking me these questions? I'm just a student." And they said to me, "Because you fit the description of a burglar who has been reported from just around the corner." Michael, my instinct was that that was completely fabricated and they were simply looking for an excuse to see inside my bag. So when I told them that my bag contained books from the library and files, and they shook their heads in disbelief, it was something of a moment when I unzipped the bag, and indeed that's exactly what was inside. Now that happened to me when I was a young man. I thereafter qualified as a lawyer, and I knew what my rights and responsibilities were. And if that ever happened to me, even at my age now, I think my reaction to the police would have been somewhat different, and I would have been much more assertive in protecting my rights. What then do we say to young people, teenagers and people in their early 20s who regularly and habitually get stopped for no good reason at all? What do we say to them about their rights and responsibilities? Well, Michael, we're going to hear some more about that later from some of my fellow panelists. All I wanted to say for now is this. To protect our communities, we do need certain powers that the police can exercise to be able to stop people if they've got reasonable suspicion. But those powers have to be used proportionately, because if they're not, then in fact what happens is you defeat the objective. If the objective is to keep our communities safe, they will not be safe if young people, particularly young Black men, feel that they are being picked on, because that creates an atmosphere of insecurity and fear. If you use stop and search correctly as a power and fairly in the circumstances, it has the potential to save lives. Because if you do stop and search someone with reasonable suspicion, and it turns out that they're carrying a knife which might have been used that very same evening or night, a police officer potentially could prevent someone being seriously injured or killed. But if you don't use it proportionately, if you use it excessively, if you use it unjustly, and if you use it by racially profiling young Black men in particular, it can have the opposite effect. Rather than saving and protecting lives, it can destroy lives. The psychological damage for a young man or a teenager, not once, not twice, but many times to be picked on by the police without good reason, that psychological damage is immeasurable. It is damage which will infect their very psyche. It will affect the way they see themselves. It will influence their interaction with authority. It will mean that they will begin to build a picture up subconsciously of themselves that they are a trouble or a problem within society. Because police officers, every time they stop someone without good reason, are reinforcing in that young Black person's mind that somehow they are a problem within society. And because young people eventually grow up, they go into their late 20s, their 30s, their 40s, and their 50s. Don't imagine for one moment that they don't carry that same feeling of exclusion and indignity throughout the rest of their lives. And that affects their self-confidence. That affects their aspiration. It affects their ambition to want to do something productive and positive within society generally, because they see themselves as being targeted. Now, Michael, we've got to stop this cycle. This is a cycle that has been going on now for decades. I'm someone who's been involved in anti-racism work way back into the 70s. I grew up at a time when people went on the streets to protest against the National Front and the British National Party and other fascist groups. We went out there to say to the police, stop abusing your powers. And back in the 80s and 90s, none of us imagined that we'd still be having the same conversations today in 2020. And so it is that when we hear about appalling events stateside, people like George Floyd being murdered in cold blood, and then we hear about stories here in this country of a man in Manchester being stopped by the police with his 2-year-old in the back of the car and being tasered in front of his young child. It makes us sit up and think, have we really made as much progress as we'd like to imagine we have? And Michael, all of us, whether we are barristers, solicitors, lawyers, legal executives, teachers, police officers, probation officers, anyone involved within the prison system, we all recognize that we have a joint and shared responsibility to get this right. But we can't get it right if the police aren't educated and trained to learn how to use their powers responsibly. We would like to believe that 20 years on from the Macpherson report, which looked into the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the problems institutionally within the police that led to a botched investigation, we would like to believe, Michael, that we've made real strides. And in many respects, and not least because of the efforts made by many of our colleagues who've been fighting against racism, yes, we have made progress. But it only takes 1 or 2 incidents in a month or in a week to remind us that we haven't really come as far as we would like. I feel that we are heading in our society into a very real crisis. The crisis arises because government, the police and the executive haven't done as much as they should be doing to check themselves, to educate themselves, and to understand that in a multiracial, multicultural society, you cannot work on the old ideas that you have, that Black people are criminals, that brown people are doing terrorism, that other minorities may be engaged in other criminal activity, as though this doesn't affect the white community at all. And when I think about it, statistics that we have already been given, that 3/4 of Black and minority young men feel that they are being unfairly targeted by the police, that's not imaginary. That's not gaslighting. That's absolutely very real. We know that most of the victims actually of knife crime, which is the usual reason that the police give for stopping and searching someone, we know that in fact most of the victims of that knife crime are people from minority communities. We know that 92% of them are male. We know that 80% of them are under 25. So we're not actually looking at a community which any racist police officer casually describes as being a criminal community. We're actually looking at a community that in large part are the victims of crimes, not the perpetrators of crime. And that's why it's important, Michael, for our part to make a huge reconcerted effort to try and address where this poison stems from. And if it is in the attitudes of police officers who are not vetted properly when they go through their training as a cadet, if they are not given the right education about the importance of diversity and inclusion in our society, and they slip through the net, then they must be picked up later on by honest colleagues who out them, who say that this person really isn't fit to be wearing a uniform. It can't be left to us in the Black and brown and minority communities in this country always to have to identify where the problem starts. The very institutions which generate these rogue officers needs to address their problems as well. So Michael, may I say, just in concluding my opening remarks, I'm more than happy, of course, to speak about my own experiences as a barrister within the system, about the damage I see done to young Black men who come through the system. But for now, I'd simply like to say in an overview that we must all try and find a solution to this problem, because it's not a walk-away situation. We're all living together. We live in big cities. We live cheek by jowl, Black, brown, Chinese people, white people, people from all around the world, particularly in an area like London. We can't simply say it's someone else's problem. It's on our doorstep, so we take responsibility for finding the right solutions.
Joe, thank you very, very much for that incredibly powerful piece of knowledge about the background and your own experience. And I don't want to tread on the toes of Sayce, who's going to be contributing shortly, but I too also have an experience, well, more than one, but one experience that left me quite shaken with the police. And if I'm experiencing that, and people like Sayce and yourself, and now Dawn Butler and another, and Bianca Williams, the list goes on. I think the statistics don't lie, and you know, with modern technology, it's starting to get captured more and more, and it's now, I think there's an awakening where people really have had enough, and hopefully those that are joining us today will at least be armed with a bit more knowledge to empower themselves should they have the almost inevitable experience of getting stopped and searched in due course. So thank you very much for sharing that. Now, community, now we're going to go on to listen to Abby Johnson, who is a leading barrister specialising in crime, who is based at 25 Bedford Row, and she specialises in serious crime inquiry work, you know, really where her attention to detail is absolutely incredible, and anyone that's instructed by her is in the best hands possible. Now, she regularly features on media. You have but to look at her profile and you'll see that she's enlightened us most recently on Channel 4. So we're incredibly honoured to have Abby as part of this panel. And she's going to now give a presentation on the actual law, which is what a lot of us signed in to listen up to. So I'm going to hand over to Abby to enlighten us more on the actual law on stop and search.
Hi guys, thank you very much for that very flattering introduction, Michael. I hope my presentation lives up to the pressure that you put me under by describing me as a leading barrister. But yeah, I'm going to keep this brief, or I'm going to keep it to between 10 and 15 minutes, because I know that there's so much that needs to be said. And I think, to be honest, that actually there's a lot already out there from people like me speaking from the legal perspective about stop and search. I want to start by saying that obviously what I'm focusing on is the law, what your rights are when you're stopped and searched. And I know that looking at the list of people who are participating in this webinar, some of the names are quite familiar to me, some are not. And I'm aware that we have a mixture of practitioners, academics, and members of the public. So if I speak first to the practitioners who are participating in this webinar, and just say that I think it's really important that we as lawyers, when we read about our clients being stopped and searched, or if we're prosecuting, we read about a defendant being stopped and searched, and we read their reaction and their attitude and so on, it's really important for us to remember that every stop and search is physical, that very often they are public, humiliating, embarrassing, and quite surprising. Now, very obviously, when we deal with these matters, they tend to be the stops that have resulted in something which has resulted in that person being arrested, being charged, and then ending up in court. But even in scenarios where someone is stopped, searched, and nothing is found, the experiences that I've had from speaking to people, particularly over the recent weeks, where we're talking more, I think, to each other, where we're participating in events like this, something which has consistently come through is just the level of intrusion that people really feel during a stop and search. And I think that it's really important that we as practitioners keep that in mind when we're then looking at these accounts in black and white, or looking at body-worn video and considering how to advise our client or how to navigate that type of evidence in court. These are real life scenarios, these are real people who are having their personal space invaded by people that they don't know without warning, without much warning. So that's a starting point. Now, to give you guys the legal background, and I'm going to look at also at the advice that police have been given about using stop and search during this particular pandemic, and then I'll go on to the general framework in terms of legislation and their powers. So the first thing to discuss, which is the advice that the police have received. I'm not going to say that this is exactly what they're following, but this is the advice that they've received. So they have been told that they should be following what's called the 4 E's. And the reason for this, which I'll explain them in a moment, but the reason for this being that we will all have seen and noticed there's been a huge expansion in terms of police powers during the coronavirus pandemic, that every time Boris Johnson and his colleagues announce that there's an increase in fines, that not just in the value of the fines, but the parameters of the fines, when they change the guidance and they change the legislation in terms of when you can be at home, when you need to be out, when you're supposed to be at work, it's left to police officers to enforce those rules. And that means a number of things. It means that it has increased the discretion that police officers have, and it's increased their subjective analysis that they apply when they walk around and they see groups of people and they determine whether or not those people are breaching the coronavirus rules and guidelines, or whether they are following it. And I think, unsurprisingly, and I know that the others are going to go on to this, I won't encroach into their areas, but unsurprisingly, that has meant that during lockdown, we have seen an increase in the number of Black people, Black men in particular, but also other ethnic minorities being stopped and searched compared to at other times. And one aspect that I find very concerning about this is that when it's happened to members of my family, when it's happened to my colleagues, as it did quite recently, they've not been wearing any PPE. So there's also that extra element of the increased number of stop and searches which are happening to people from Black and minority ethnic communities, the physical element of it, the public element of it, the embarrassing element of it, and then also being touched by people who have touched others and they're not wearing PPE. But we're seeing this increase. And why are we seeing this increase? Well, one of the reasons is that the police have been encouraged to use their own discretion as to who it is that they speak to. They are told that they should engage with people, that's the first E. They should ask them why they're out. They should explain the law and, if necessary, set out the reason why they need to be inside, stressing the risks to public health. So they should then encourage them to go home if they have no reasonable excuse, and they should enforce only as a last resort. I find it no surprise really then that the people who get to that fourth E, the enforcement as a last resort, tend to be the people who look and maybe act quite differently to the way that police officers would perceive to be normal behaviour. And very often that's people who belong to ethnic minority communities, and like I said before, Black men in particular. And I think that it's very important that we do keep sight of that difference, that although all ethnic minorities are disproportionately stopped and searched by the police, as you've seen in the video that was played earlier, it's Black people in particular who are disproportionately affected by these measures. So what is stop and search? There's two aspects of scenarios which are commonly described as stop and search, but actually they're very different from one another. One is stop and account, and one is stop and search. So a stop and account occurs when a police officer or a police community support officer stops you and they ask you questions. And that's not a stop and search. You're free to leave at any time. If you want to work out if you're being stopped and searched, or if you're just having a stop and account, you simply ask the officer, you say, am I being detained? And if the officer says, no, you're not being detained, it's a stop and account, then technically, under the law, you are free to leave. The police officer is not allowed to use the fact that you have left a stop and account as the only basis for them to have a reasonable suspicion for them to stop and search you. That's what the law says. The reality is, we have this scenario where police officers are using these 4 E's to engage with you, to explain the law, to encourage you to go home, and then to enforce as a last resort. So if they do that during the stop and account stage, and you start to walk off, and they can say anything really nowadays, can't they? They can say, well, you know, I thought they were mingling and therefore there were more than 6 of them. And that's the reason that I had a reasonable suspicion that there was some sort of criminal activity that was happening, and therefore I searched them. So I think the reality is that if you're in a scenario where a police officer is asking you questions, if you think, look, this is a scenario where I can either just continue answering these questions and it can be done with, and you're fine with that, it might be more simple to just do that and walk off at a calm stage, rather than just turning around, walking away, and potentially having the matter escalate. But so that you're aware, you are, under the law, able to walk away if it's simply a stop and account, if you're not being detained. Now, for a stop and search, this is a slightly different scenario, and if a legal stop and search is differentiated from that stop and account scenario that we spoke about just recently. If a police officer has reasonable grounds to believe that you've been involved in a crime, or that you're in possession of a prohibited item, then they can search you. But it's only a police officer that can do this, and it should only be your outer clothing. If the officer is not in uniform, they should show their identity card to you, and you don't have to give your name, and you don't have to give your address. You should not be stopped and searched because of your race, your age, your gender, your sexual orientation, your disability, religion, faith, the way you dress, the language you speak, or because you've committed a crime in the past. And what I see very often happen is a police officer will walk up to somebody and say, do you have a criminal record? Before they say pretty much anything else to that person. That cannot be a basis on its own for them to stop and search you, because otherwise they have a blanket to stop and search anyone that has ever even stolen a minor item from a shop, which obviously cannot be the case. Now, a police officer can use reasonable force if you try not to be searched, and that could lead to you being arrested. However, before an officer searches you, they should tell you their name, they should tell you the name of their police station, they should tell you what they are looking for, and they should tell you that you are entitled to have a copy of the search record, or they should tell you how you can find your search record depending on how they've made that. They either write it down by hand, in which case they should give you the pink slip behind it, which should have all of those details that I've just listed, or they should give you a receipt number if they're typing it up. So you can basically go onto a website, type in that code and get that data. Now, if the police have any reasonable grounds to think that you're in possession of a controlled drug, they've got to tell you the law that they are searching you under, and they've got to give you the reasons for that search. And I can tell you that most of the time they'll say it's under Section 23 of the Misuse of Drugs Act, and a lot of the time they'll say it's because they can smell cannabis. But smelling cannabis on its own wouldn't be enough of a reason. They'd need to tell you the actual legislation, and they'd need to explain everything together. So ask them for the legislation, ask them for the reasons. Obviously try and do it as politely as you can. Now, there are other reasons that a police officer might want to stop and search you, and there are wider powers that are available in certain situations for them to stop and search you when they have no reasonable suspicion. And that will be in a particular scenario under Section 60 of an Act. And basically what this means is that it enables a search for dangerous instruments or offensive weapons without reasonable grounds, but that's only if there has been a Section 60 order made by an inspector or above who believes that there are incidents which may involve serious violence that might take place within the area, and it's expedient to give that authorization so that basically an officer can approach anybody within that particular area, search them, let them go on their way. That's the idea. Those orders are only valid for 24 hours, but they can and they usually are extended. And in general, they are publicly announced. You should be aware that's in place so that when you're in that area, you at least know that by being in that area, you are susceptible to being stopped and searched. I saw that a lot during the Black Lives Matter protests, that Section 60 orders were made, and it effectively meant that the police officers, once they kettled people, could stop and search people as they left and went to go home at the end of the protests. So that's the law, that's the framework, but the reality of it is really different, and I respect that and I acknowledge that. To give you guys an example, I had a friend very recently who is a barrister who was stopped and searched while they were on their way to court. It was the first time that they had had any such interaction with the police. They didn't grow up in this country. And they were so shocked by what was happening to them that they forgot to ask for their receipts. They forgot to get the name or the badge number of the police officer. They couldn't tell me what the legislation was that the police officer had stopped them under. And they couldn't remember why it was that police officers were at the location that they were at. What they did tell me was the police officer told them those things at the time, but because of what was happening had taken them aback so much, none of those details had gone into their brain. They just couldn't remember any of those details afterwards. So I acknowledge very full well that it's all very well us as legal practitioners giving you this advice, but whether you'll actually remember it in the moment is something else entirely. So what I would say to you is that there are a number of online resources that are available and are particularly good. So I can put them into the Q&A section, but the two resources that I always point people towards is Why Stop, which is a brilliant organisation which is run by young people who have day-to-day impact with police officers, who speak to people about this type of thing on a regular basis. And they've produced some fantastic resources and guidance which is available, including a bust card, which basically has on it what you should ask an officer or what you can ask an officer, and also coping mechanisms that you can put in place during a stop and search. So for example, if you feel it's safe to do so, if you feel it won't exacerbate the situation, you could, for example, record the stop and search using your phone. Just make sure the officer knows that's what you're doing so that you reaching into your pocket, for example, doesn't trigger any sort of reaction from the police officer. But they have bus cards on there which you can have on your phone, which you can put into your wallet, which you can put into your pocket, particularly if you live in an area where you know that you are likely to be stopped and searched. Because I know, for example, I have cousins who won't walk down certain roads because they know that even in their school uniform, they're likely to be stopped by police officers. But having that there, it can mean that when that moment does happen and all of this information goes out of your mind, you have something in front of you to guide you in terms of what you can say and what you can ask a police officer, or better yet, if you're with someone who's being stopped and searched. So you're slightly out at that moment, you can look at that card, you can remember that information on their behalf, you can write it down for them and make sure that they have it when they then leave. And as Michael will go on to discuss later on, an extra resource, or a fantastic resource, which has been developed by Legal Lifelines, is an app which can connect you with legal advice, so that if the matter does escalate and you are arrested, you can be connected to a solicitor who will have specific knowledge about this area of law, if perhaps you don't want to rely on a duty solicitor. YStop also has a parallel app which is aimed at complaints and raising complaints about the circumstances of your stop and search. So hopefully that makes you guys feel a little more covered, a little more secure in terms of the legal framework. And as Michael has said, if you guys have any questions in the second hour of this, then I'm happy to answer any questions that you have around the law or around practice for this particular area. Thank you very much, guys.
Abby, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating and equally shocking, even though we're all here because of this horrible issue of stop and search. It just, you know, to hear that a barrister, you know, Queen's Counsel, Sayce has gone through it, I've gone through it. It's just something that's completely endemic in the system, and hopefully, you know, we'll get to the bottom of it in due course. But thank you very much for enlightening everyone with the law so eloquently, and I'm sure everyone appreciates your expertise there, and there'll be lots of questions for us in due course. So now we're going to talk to our next, hear from our next speaker, which is Dr. Rita Dalton Harrison. And she's a senior lecturer at the Royal Holloway University, London. And as a former solicitor that specialised in crime and was responsible for setting up the law school there, she has, you know, she's very, very well qualified to talk to us about the topic which she's about to enlighten us about. So over to you, Rita, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. What I'd like to do is pick up on what Joe has said about accountability, and also what Abby has said about the subjectiveness of the stop and searches. So I'm just going to give us a run through of some statistics, some policy, and also some research. So looking at this really through the lens of what can we do better. So I've got some slides here about policing and consent with approval, because I think it's really important to remember that actually the police do police with our consent. So I'm going to start with a quote from Sir Robert Peel, who was of course a former Prime Minister, a Conservative Prime Minister, and is often credited with being the founding father of the modern police force. So here the quotation says, the police are the public and the public are the police. The police are paid to give full attention to duties that are incumbent upon every citizen in the interest of community welfare and existence. I think that's really, really important, because what it reminds us is that it's a partnership between the police and the public. And the public want the police to police the streets. They want the police to keep the public safe. And I think some recent stories that have been in the media about the deaths of police officers, that really brings home to us that policing is a dangerous occupation. It has risks. So I think we need to keep that in mind as we go through, because I think that is a kind of background often to some of the subjectiveness that comes out in the approach to policing and stop and search. On the question of accountability, obviously the police have powers which are given to them in law, and we're going to look at that, and Abby has gone through many of those powers in PACE, for example, and Section 60, for example. So the police do have powers written in legislation, written in law, that gives them the right to stop and search. But that has to be balanced really with the rights that the public have, and those rights are set out, for example, in the Human Rights Act, in the Equality Act, And so the public are also protected in law in terms of their freedoms and their rights. So there has to be a balance between those powers and rights. And really that balance comes through in the duty. And the duty of policing is about transparency. It's about respecting the public. It's about fairness. It's what effectively is called legitimacy. So the police have a professional responsibility through their leaders, through their themselves in terms of the way they conduct themselves in their employment, to make sure that effectively there is that correct balance between those powers and those rights. So I've just got on this slide just some of the various acts where the police have stop and search powers, and they are wide-ranging, far-reaching powers. So we've talked about Section 1, for example, stolen property, going equipped for theft, drugs, for example. We'll see from some of the statistics, it's actually Section 60 that is concerning in terms of the statistics, because that seems to be where the rise is taking place, and that gives the police powers to stop and search not just individuals but also vehicles in relation to looking for offensive weapons and so on. The Misuse of Drugs Act is another piece of legislation that causes some concern, mainly because there isn't much guidance given to police officers in terms of stop and search under the Misuse of Drugs Act. And Abby has mentioned, for example, that one of the factors that police officers may talk about is smelling cannabis, and that itself is not sufficient. And even the College of Policing has made it clear in their guidance that just smelling cannabis is not in itself enough for a stop and search. There must be more. There must be more evidence to support that in terms of reasonable suspicion. Section 163 of the Road Traffic Act I've put up there as well, because that again is causing concerns. That gives officers powers to stop vehicles. And that again is commonly being used as a reason for stop and searches. I've put in pink here on this slide the Mental Health Act, because even though that's not essentially a stop and search in that there must be a warrant before there is a search as such, I've put it there because there are rising numbers of police stopping individuals with mental health issues. And this is a growing area, and the Sainsbury's Centre for Mental Health has said in a report that the police do need more mental health training around detention of those with mental health issues. And at Royal Holloway, work around mental health, particularly in Black men, and looking at the perceptions of Black men in terms of this conflict between being seen to be strong and yet having vulnerabilities that come out of essentially being seen in a racialized context. And so those two things can really cause the conflict within a person's self. And so more training around mental health is really key as well, I think, in this area, as the police continue to get more and more powers. And of course, legislation is being extended all the time in this current epidemic with COVID. So the numbers are there from April 2018 to March 2019, 375,588 stop and searches, and that excludes vehicles. So that's just stops and searches of individuals. So some more statistics as well. Why do we have this imbalance? Well, let's look at some of the figures. So in terms of white officers within the forces across England and Wales, you'll see the disparity there. So we've only got 1,492 Black officers, and this comes from the Ministry of Justice figures for 2019, as against 111,695 white officers. And then for every white individual stopped and searched, 38 Black individuals are stopped and searched. So that again is a recent statistic from the Home Office. It's quite interesting to note that in terms of the groups that are being stopped, and Abby has referred to this, by far the largest group are Black individuals. So in terms of, for example, other groups, Asian, Chinese, there's a very interesting research which has been carried out by Jefferson, which suggests that actually some positive stereotyping takes place, where effectively Asian groups are thought to be more compliant, are thought to have steadier, more stable home lives. And that's the image that police officers have when they're policing. So those groups may be targeted less than, for example, Black groups. And that's not to say that Asian groups are not targeted, they are, but there is a disparity in the numbers. So another statistic here in the London region, interestingly, stop and search is coming down under Section 1 of PACE. So that's the more wide-ranging powers, but it's rising for Section 60, as we can see, particularly in London and the West Midlands. And I think it's really, really important to note, if we go back to the 80s, certainly a period that I remember of the riots in major cities, in London, in Bristol, in Birmingham, in Liverpool, they were around the fact that essentially stop and search was being used in disproportionate numbers for certain groups of people. So the Scarman report, for example, made it very clear that something had to be done. So let's look at what has happened really since the 80s and what progress has been made, because there are frameworks for fairness. It's not that nothing has happened, but let's look. So we've got, first of all, the police work under a code of ethics. So the College of Policing Code of Ethics, which is set out there on the left. So accountability, integrity, openness, fairness, leadership, respect, honesty, objectivity, selflessness. Now these they are very similar to the Nolan principles, which bind civil servants, so the Civil Servants Code of Ethics. Now, Abby has talked about the 4 E's as a framework for police officers to think about how they go about stop and search. And with most of these approaches, ethics is at the core, the very core of the approach to policing. So I'm going to look at some other approaches later on, but I want you just to look to the table on your right, which is the best use of stop and search scheme. And this is a scheme which was brought in 2014, partly as a result of campaigning by organisations such as Stopwatch. And this has actually helped in terms of accountability, because it does mean that the police forces that are signed up to the bus scheme have to effectively show data recording, that they've got a system of lay observation where members of the public can actually police with the police, so they can actually go on the beat with police officers and see what is going on and how they police. Proper complaints mechanism, well, all police forces have to have that. But again, those in the bus scheme must have that. Reduction of Section 60 stop and searches is the aim within the bus scheme. Now, the problem with the bus scheme is that not all police forces are members of the scheme. And certainly by 2016, when the scheme had been operating for a couple of years, there were 13 police forces that were members. And at the time that Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary did their report in February 2016, about 7 of those police forces had been thrown off the scheme for not complying and had yet to be put back in the scheme. So it's a very, very good scheme if all police forces were signed up to it, and that's one of the difficulties. So other frameworks for fairness then. So Abby has talked about the equality of encounter models, so effectively the 4 E's, but there are other models that police forces across the country may follow in terms of policing, including stop and search. So we have Go Wisely, for example. So the Go Wisely scheme, so effectively that's talking to an individual effectively about what the police are doing. So it's things like showing them a warrant card, identifying yourself, telling them the purpose for the search and so on. The national decision model has about 6 different steps to it that the police are supposed to follow, and again that's all wrapped around the code of ethics. So it's very much looking at making sure that the search and the stop and search is fair, and that there is enough evidence on which to stop to begin with, that they have actually observed what is going on and so on. POSH is another approach that police officers can take. It's about painting the scene, first of all, observing before moving in. But the difficulty with many of these models is, again, is on the question of the police deciding whether they have sufficient evidence to be moving in and actually making the stop and search, and whether actually it's based on subjectiveness or not. So we have these frameworks for fairness, yet as we can see from some of the reports which have taken place recently, and Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary has now been merged with the Fire and Rescue Service, but their report in 2013, they say, we found that with a few exceptions, forces were not able to demonstrate an approach to using stop and search powers that was based upon a foundation of evidence of what works best to fight crime. By 2013, we've got the ethics panel, the London Ethics Panel, who say the public gives dramatic authority to the Metropolitan Police to secure their rights and freedoms. The public rightly demands that the police gain and maintain their confidence and consent. But the pressures of using this authority, especially in a complex place like modern London, tend to develop amongst the police self-protective attitudes that make them act in ways that are less likely to gain that consent. And I think that's really, really is important. And I'll look at some research in a moment, but it's very interesting to think about what is in a police officer's mind when they are policing the streets, because there is an element of fear and there are great risks. And that is appreciated by the public, but it's really about being fair and transparent about the stop and search and why you're doing it. The most recent report, no force has fully met our 2017 legitimacy recommendation to address the disproportionate use of stop and search involving BAME people. It is important that forces understand the causes of this disproportionality and explain it to the public. So by 2009, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary Fire Rescue Service are still saying that forces are not meeting the requirements for legitimacy in terms of being fair and transparent and respect in the way that they are policing. So there's clearly a problem despite the frameworks which have been put in place. So what does the research say? This is just some research. There are lots of researchers and academics out there doing amazing work in this area. So I've just given you a snapshot of some of the research that exists out there. So going back to 1985, David Smith and Jeremy Gray's research was really about reasonable suspicion, and it was telling us that it wasn't properly being used as a criterion for stopping and searching. And it's ironic that we're still saying the same thing today. So is there something wrong about the guidance? Is there something wrong with Code A of PACE, which, by the way, has not been reviewed or amended since 2015, although other codes of PACE have been? David Brown in 1997, black men are more likely to be stopped and searched than any other race. That's still happening today. Benjamin Bolin and Coretta Phillips, stop and search will gain public support if it is carried out with courtesy. Now that's what the frameworks are intended to do. So that is what the aim is. But is it effective? Is it happening? The Equality and Human Rights Commission in their 2010 report said that achieving perfect policing is unrealistic. So they accepted that. So what they were saying is that what we should be aiming for is good enough policing, because we'll never get perfect policing. So good enough policing is what the public deserves. But that has not even been achieved. So we're not even at that level. And so again, still certain groups are being disproportionately affected by stop and search. Joel Miller in 2010, monitoring and accountability has more impact on stop and search than any rigid legal framework. So the police need to police themselves. And we have watchdogs, we have independent organisations like Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, but they need more teeth. They need to have more powers and more sanctions and penalties if forces aren't complying, and all forces should be made to join the bus scheme. Paul Quinton says decision-making amongst police officers is based on their experiences during patrol, which can be misleading and inaccurate. And I think that's a really interesting piece of work, and I'd like to see that really developed in some qualitative research with stories of police officers and stories of the public as to really what are the perceptions, what are the fears, what are the ignorances around how we all view each other. And Charles Epp and others, political pressure, for example, the recent rise in knife crimes, that is what drives increases in stop and search. And it's interesting that actually the figures for stop and search were coming down, but seem to have started to rise again as of last year. And then finally, Ben Bradford and Matteo Tiratelli say no link between increased stop and search and reduction in crime. So there you have it. So these measures are not effective in terms of reducing crime, but they are effective in terms of alienating certain groups in the community that the police would want to work with. So finally then, next steps. What do we do? That's what we're all here to discuss effectively. So I've just set out some 6 steps that we could consider. Revision of Code A of PACE. There is lots of guidance out there. The College of Policing has guidance, but put it into PACE. Let's actually see it being enforced. I'd like to see personally a unifying act on stop and search. We've got stop and search spread over so many different pieces of legislation. Let's put it into one piece in the same way that we did with the Law of Evidence, with the Criminal Justice Act. Mandatory data collection and monitoring is not mandatory for all aspects, and that is a problem for the inspectorate. And so again, forces should be obliged to collect data. The PEEL tables, interesting tables. PEEL effectively stands for Police Effectiveness, Efficiency and Legitimacy. So as I said, legitimacy, treating the public with fairness and respect. And so Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, they measure the performance of various police forces against the PEEL tables. So what I'm suggesting here, very controversially, is funding. Perhaps funding should be tied to performance in PEEL tables. I can certainly think as an academic how often funding is tied to performance for lecturers and universities and schools. Why should that be different for the police force? It's just a question I put out there. Targeted recruitment, we can see there are not enough Black, Asian and minority ethnic police officers out there. And finally, more qualitative research. Because I'm a researcher, I'm interested to hear stories, and I really would like to hear more about stories of the police and the public, because often what we get with stop and search are the statistics. So let's hear the stories behind those statistics. Thank you.
Dr. Rita, thank you very much for your very full summary of the history of the police. And actually, you touching on Sir Robert Peel, I think it's very important to remember that the police were started with the right intentions, and actually we need more engagement from proactive charities like Mentivity, and the work that Sayce is doing to engage with the police, and education from all sides to try and stem the tide of this endless cycle of stop and search and wrongdoing. But also, I think it would be appropriate for me to, certainly for myself, send out my condolences to Sergeant Ratner's family, because, you know, police are human beings, and you know, obviously there's a family grieving, and you know, any loss of life, whether in uniform or outside of uniform, is a real tragedy. And obviously we're going to hear from Dorris shortly, and you know, it could have been Dorris or any other people trying to do the right thing. I just think there needs to be a look at the system for the reasons that you just mentioned, and others, Doctor, as to where it's all going wrong. Segueing nicely into Dorris Jessett. Dorris, as I mentioned earlier, is a former police officer, and so and is now an outreach worker with a charity called the Violence Intervention Project, which does incredible work with the most vulnerable in our society, and you know, really is on the front line of protecting people. And I know from Dorris's own work that she works tirelessly, including often weekends, not just giving her time on a Saturday back to the community, and thank you very much to everyone again, but also taking people away from extremely dangerous situations. So Dorris can offer a unique insight of policing, not just as a police officer, but a black police officer, which I think is incredibly important given what we're talking about, and can give us a unique insight now as to her experience when she used to be on the beat.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the introduction. I don't know if I can follow my colleagues who have spoken so eloquently. I don't know what I can contribute, but I shall try. Thank you for the introduction. As you said, I am a former police officer. I'm actually retired because I was a police officer for 30 years in the Metropolitan Police. You do 30 years and then you retire. I have been retired for 3 years now, and I am now working, as you said, for the Violence Intervention Project. It's therapeutic outreach for those young people who are engaged on the wrong side of the law, trying to help them in the difficult circumstances that they are in. So I do a lot of work with the families and with the young people. I've got experiences of stop and search, both as a police officer in the police and as a member of the public as well. I think my experiences are a bit different to everybody else's, because, you know, as a police officer, when you're stopped, I know the procedure, so I will remain calm. But there's a difference where you can get out your warrant card and show the officer that's stopping you that you are actually a police officer. It does make a difference. So I have that experience, yeah, as a police officer and a member of the public. A lot has been said about statistics and our rights and what we can do. So I won't repeat any of that, but I mean, if I could talk a little bit about young people and their attitudes when they are stopped. The advice that I would give, you know, is to remain calm. It's easier said than done when you're in a position where, you know, you're frightened of what's going to be happening. To make eye contact with the officers and ask the right questions. You know, why am I being stopped? What is the reason for the stop? You would ask, you know, what's your name? What station are you from? Those are the kinds of questions. Also, remember to ask for a receipt or a stop and search form, because officers are supposed to give you a stop and search form, and it will detail everything that's why they've stopped you and who has stopped you. Not always easy, and not always the officers will give you that. But to know your rights, Abby has mentioned a few of the you know, about the rights. And what you can do, and what are our rights when we are stopped. And also that would encourage good behaviour, hopefully good behaviour from the officers, or that they should behave properly towards the young people. For me, you know, having spoken about young people and their attitudes, what about the attitudes of the officers that are stopping the young people? This is a real training issue. As has been mentioned already. And I think the change in attitudes, police need to change their attitudes towards the Black and ethnic community and their stop and search powers. Because if this isn't looked at, it's all very well for me to talk about young people changing their attitudes, but the police need to change their attitudes. So I think those two things together hopefully will create a change. We also spoke, when I joined the police 30 years ago, the Metropolitan Police, there were 30,000 officers. And of those officers, there were only 400 Black and ethnic minority officers within the Metropolitan Police. I'm not talking about nationally, I'm just talking about police officers in London. So that's a very small number. So the community wasn't very well represented. I joined the police to make a difference and to help. I don't know what help that I have given, but I like to think that I've made a difference. It is a very difficult job to do. In every organisation, there are bad apples, but I've also worked with a lot of good people as well. Those that care about the community, those that care about the circumstances and their backgrounds, and those that try to help. So there are good police officers. If I can just turn my attention to stopping and searching, I found that very difficult, stopping and searching young people from the community. But I like to think that I had an attitude where I wasn't going to meet aggression with aggression, that if I went in at a low level and I was met with an aggressive attitude, that aggressive attitude would eventually come down. I like to think that I cared about the young people that I was stopping and searching. And I would always follow the procedure, give my name, what station I'm from, show my warrant card if I was in plain clothes, let them know why I was stopping them. And it was always a genuine reason. I'm not saying that every stop and search went well, didn't always go well, but I like to think that I cared about those that I was stopping. And I think that's why we should have more police officers that genuinely care about the community. There's not a lot that I can say, but when we talk about stop and searching young people, one particular experience that I have of stopping and searching a young person led to me going and seeing that young person at their house and talking to their family. And the young person was engaged in some low-level crime. And this young person, I asked him, what would you like to be? You know, he said that he would like to be a paediatrician. So I gently informed him that if he continued in the way of life that he was leading, he would not become a paediatrician. I think it led to change, because the long and the short of the story is that this young person has received a first-class honours degree and is now a paediatrician. So I think that stopping and searching and caring about the young people that you're stopping and searching and putting them on the right path can lead to change. It can lead to change. But again, as I've said, it doesn't always work out in the best way. If we can change the attitudes of the officers that are stopping and searching, and if we can change the attitudes of some of the young people that are stopped, then we may get the change that we want. But it is also a frightening experience for a young person to be stopped and searched or to be approached by uniformed officers. They don't know what's going to happen. And if they don't know their rights and they end up being taken down to the police station, that's a whole different ballgame that they're dealing with. So any help that I can give a young person as a violence intervention officer, I'm going to give them that help. I'm going to help them. We do a lot of work in custodies as well. So we go and we talk to young people about their rights and the best way to deal with things. And I think it just puts a young person at ease, especially if it's the first time that they've been stopped and searched. But it's not only for young people, it's adults as well. Because if you're not expected to be stopped and searched by an officer, it's also good to know your rights. Even if you do know your rights, you're going to be, there's going to be some kind of adrenaline going in you, you know, and things that you know are going to go out the window because you can't remember what you're supposed to do or how you're supposed to act. And it's only afterwards that you realize I could have done this or I could have done that, you know. So I don't have a lot to say because my colleagues have already said a lot of it about the statistics and the experiences of people that have been stopped and searched, but that's my input for now. So if anybody has any questions for me about my time in the police or VIP, then I'm more than happy to answer them.
Dorris, well, thank you so much for sharing your insight and your service that you've done and the service that you continue to give back to the community. And I think some of what you said was so important. We're going to go on to talk about, to hear from Sayce Holmes-Lewis, who almost needs no introduction because many of those listening will know of him for the great work that he also does on the front line of the community, and his experience with a high-profile stop and search, which was well documented, and he appeared on Sky News and others. And I know that Sayce is going to explain a bit more about himself and his background and what he does now, so I'm not going to tread on his toes there. But what I would say is I think those that have seen the footage of what happened with Sayce, he did remain calm. And I think your advice clearly is important there, Dorris, that is to remain calm in a situation of conflict, because ultimately violence begets violence. But over to you, Sayce, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to all the panelists as well. Thank you for all your insight and knowledge, and welcome to everybody. I'm going to quickly just share the screen and quickly go through who I am and the reason why I'm doing this work, essentially, and how I got there. And it's not always been me kind of dealing with it in a calm manner. It's something that I've had to learn and something that's been very difficult over the years as a young black man growing up in the community that I've grown up in. The reason why I got this picture up is because I'm from the Aylesbury estate, so it's in between Peckham, Camberwell, Old Kent Road. It's disappearing quickly now because obviously the regeneration in the area, but that's somewhere where I grew up for 24 years of my life. And it's something that taught me a lot in terms of police interactions. When I was young, the Aylesbury estate was notorious for all the wrong reasons. And the reason why, because a lot of drugs were sold, violence, a lot of police were in and around the estate. And it was pretty much a maze. If you wasn't from the estate, if anyone knows the Aylesbury estate, it was a maze. If you went there, you would get lost just walking around by yourself. And it was a great community, even though in the stairwells you have a lot of paraphernalia, needles and things like that. It was something that you had to navigate as a young black man growing up in the estate, not far from Millwall, and experiencing racism at the age of 8 and not knowing the reason why I've been victimized for this reason. And this is me and my first three siblings on the estate. But I first came into contact with a police officer negatively at the age of 14. I was going home from school. Age of 14, going home from school, I went to Kingsdale School, which back then wasn't a great school. Now it's a fantastic school. And as I was getting onto the train, I sat down and a police officer called me off the train. Now, he called me off the train, I walked over to him, I asked him, what's the reason for him calling me off the train, what have I done? He asked me to get off the train. I didn't refuse. I said, if you tell me the reason, then I'll get off the train and I'll cooperate. There's no issue. No sooner had I said that last word, he dragged me off the train. He punched me up against the fence, hit me in my abdomen twice with a truncheon, handcuffed me, dragged me along the platform, up the stairs, with all my friends and commuters, people coming from work, parents and professionals, outraged at what was going on. And they questioned the police officer. He arrested me on the way up. He arrested me when I got to the top of the stairs, and they said I could go home. Now, that was my first real kind of interaction with a police officer. I had been stopped before, had been searched before, but this was obviously different. I was 14, you could see me at the bottom, 14 years of age, year 9, you know, someone that wasn't involved in anything negative. And me and my mother took it to court. We went to the crowd, we put in a claim for assault, and that was rejected by the CPS, even though we had CCTV evidence, eyewitness accounts. And I was then basically charged with assault in a police officer. So I had to go to Camberwell Court, age of 14, in my school uniform, scared because I'm thinking I'm going to be charged and, you know, something's going to happen to me. I was young. I thought I was going to go to prison. And the fact that that injustice now that I faced, that was something that I had to face now for 23 years. You know, every time I got stopped by police, you know, which has been in excess of 30 times, I've been stopped and searched by police, you know, in my vehicle, on the streets, whilst I'm carrying out my duties. I've even been stopped by armed police under counter-terrorism laws and being told that I look like a terrorist because of my beard. And the thing is that this is something that I've experienced, you know, for a long time. And it's something which, in terms of analysing my kind of emotional intelligence and how to deal with these situations, I met it with anger, with frustration because of that injustice. Now, in terms of the stop and search, which happened during lockdown, I'm going to show you a quick video. I was actually delivering food to friends that had lost family members to COVID. On one weekend, I lost 3 people, 2 to a cardiac arrest and 1 to COVID. And I decided, let me cook something for some people and deliver the food, rather than just send a message and send my condolences. And I'm also a key worker because I run Mentivity, which is a mentoring organisation and alternative education provision. So a lot of young people that were vulnerable at that time needed support. You know, many of them going to food banks needed support in terms of food and even financial support at that time. So on the Tuesday, the 5th of May, I was on my last drop-off, dropping food to the last person. And before I was stopped, I saw a police officer stopping 2 young men, 1 black boy, 1 white boy. And it looked kind of, you know, distressing. So I wound down my window, didn't get out the car because obviously COVID and social distancing. And I just asked the boys, are you guys okay? They looked over me and said, yeah, we're okay. But I could tell that they were quite stressed. All the police officers turned around, looked at me. I wound up my window. I said, all right, take care. And I went to the shop to get some dates to break my fast because it was during Ramadan. So as I got back into my car, I was in my car for no longer than 45 seconds. I'm driving down the Walworth Road in Southeast London. I see the blue lights behind me. I pull over, not thinking it's for me. As I pull over, the police officers pull over and said under Section 23 of the Misuse of Drugs Act that they're going to stop and search me, that I look like a drug dealer, I fit the profile because there's high crime in the area. So I'm just going to quickly just play this video.
Youth worker Sayce Holmes-Lewis was stopped and searched during lockdown in May. He was taking food to a bereaved relative in South London.
They're searching my car for drugs, even though I told them what I do. They checked me and they've not found anything.
No drugs were found.
Like, you detain me because of what? Because of perception. Because you perceive me to be something I'm not, which is just ridiculous.
Sayce runs a mentoring programme and knows his rights. He lodged a complaint.
But you know what's going to happen? I'm going to get you all in the room. I'm going to train you guys how to talk to young people.
And so he did. Sayce is now training new recruits to the Met Police in Southwark and Lambeth.
So for me, that was my solution to this kind of injustice in that respect, because it's something that's happened to me over and over again. And I would be left frustrated. I've been stopped and searched with my son. My son is 14 now. You know, as young as 9, I've been stopped and searched with him in the car. And it's something now which got to a point after 23 years of kind of dealing with it in the same way, in an emotional way, rather than based on my rights and being informed and being empowered. I decided to commence a training program. So I called my local counsellors. I spoke to whoever I needed to speak to at the Met Police, and I made it happen. Within 6 weeks, we ran our first training program at Scotland Yard. Now, I never thought I'd be invited, voluntarily into Scotland Yard, ever in my life. And for me to run the training program there around stop and search, around cultural equity and conscious bias, because I don't believe it's unconscious, it was very symbolic for me and it's very empowering for me. And it's something now, because I run an organisation, I've worked with young people since the age of 16 in and around Southwark and Lambeth and Lewisham. I felt that I had to take a stand in the right channel, in the right way, which is what I've done. And for me, I'm on a new journey now, because I found an even greater purpose in addition to what I've been doing and working with young people in pupil referral units, in sporting contexts, and just providing support to families through the organisation. But this now is something I've been majorly passionate about because of that injustice that I faced at the age of 14. This can now happen to my son. My son is 14. He's at a very pivotal age. And for me, it's about changing the landscape and bringing the community together to be more informed and more empowered, but also increase the emotional intelligence in our young boys, especially young black boys, so that they can navigate these situations, feeling empowered without getting emotional. Because that's the problem, is that when you get angry, you get emotional, that's going to be amplified. It's never counteracted with positivity by the police. I'm not saying that I've not had positive interaction with police, because I have. However, it's 90% negative, and that's my experience. So now it's about holding the police to account. And since this and launching this program now, I'm now advising MOPAC and the mayor around the mayor's action plan in terms of how we make the police more accountable for their actions. And I think that we haven't been coordinated as a community in terms of holding the police to account. And I think it's so important to do so. And it's great, just sharing the stories, my experience of the police, and not just pointing fingers and saying, look, you guys are institutionally racist. Like, they know this. The McPherson report alludes to this. We know this already. But it's about having open, honest dialogue. It's about actually understanding why they have this worldview, why they see black boys as being criminals, why the media portrays us in this way. And that's why I say it's conscious, because it's a worldview that is constructed based on your consumption of certain kind of information. And, when you're speaking to the new recruits, they're mostly from rural parts of the UK. They don't understand London. They come here, they're very scared. And they see, when I've asked questions, their impression of the Black British community is what they get from the media. People are referring to boys in the hood, which is America. It's nothing to do with our culture. That this is where they form their worldview. When I ask the recruits, who knows about jerk chicken? Only 2 people put their hands up. So you've got people coming into the community that don't understand the people that they're trying to police in the area. So that's something which needs to be focused on in terms of recruitment and the officers that have been recruited in certain areas. And I feel it comes down to education, understanding and empathy. And if you're not open to that as a police officer, then you're in the wrong profession. And I think, I heard about the ride-alongs. We're doing ride-alongs. One of my directors at Mentivity, Leon, he's doing regular ride-alongs now with the police in Croydon. And actually, the officer that passed, we had interactions with him over the last couple of months. And it's extremely sad that that's happened to him. And we understand the risk that police face, carrying out these duties. But we also got to understand the risks that our young people face on a day-to-day basis as well, and why we have this issue of youth violence, not just in London, but across the UK. So again, it's about open, honest dialogue and sharing these experiences and finding solutions, because I'm honestly fed up with the complaining. This is what we do as British. We're great complainers, and we don't find the solutions. And being part of this panel today, and with such esteemed colleagues, this is about now finding a solution. It's so important now in this pivotal time, going through what we're going through in terms of COVID-19, but also with the issues, which is another virus of racism, and how we're treated and how we're depicted. Is about challenging that narrative and showcasing in so many different ways. So for the training program, I've got 3 areas which we're really focused on, which is the conscious bias training and cultural equity. So as I said, open, honest dialogue. But the outreach program is very, very key. Getting these same officers that are policing in these areas to come and do work with Mentivity, to go with Palace for Life Foundation or different partners and actually get to know young people, coming into the schools of us, actually mentoring and being trained to engage young people. Because the social capacity, especially the new officers, is very, very minimal, because most of these officers have been brought up on their phones. They don't even know how to engage in meaningful dialogue. And you've got young people that have the same issue. So now pushing on to that is the Race and Aspirations project, which is around recruitment. Most young people would never want to be a Bobby on the beat. However, they might want to work in cyber crimes. They might want to be admin assistant. There's so many different ways that they can become part of the system. So we've got a program that we're running with Goldman Sachs called the Raising Aspirations Project, and we're actually rolling out to other corporations now, which is very, very important, and actually creating visible and viable opportunities for employment. And until we actually infiltrate the Met Police through obviously the channels of recruitment and obviously policy and accountability, we're not going to see a change. Because 20 years on from the McPherson report, nothing has changed. We're in the same boat, the same place. So I think that we have to have another approach, and this is our offer for Mentivity. We're finding that it's going to be impactful. It's already been impactful so far, but again, it takes us all. And for you guys giving up your time on a Saturday afternoon to be here and listen to myself as well as the other panelists is so important. And it's important to feed this information back to our youth so that they can feel informed and empowered when they're in these situations.
Thank you so much. Do you know what? There's so much negativity out there. It's so important that I think everyone hears from you and the other panelists about the positive things that are going on in the front line. And, you know, you're pushing the boundaries, and it's really exciting to hear more about the work you're doing. And please do keep it up. And I'm sure if there's anyone that's listening to the work that Sayce is doing and what we've heard from Dorris as well, both of them and their organisations could do with our donations. So please give your funds and your time so that they can give back and do the work they do so effectively and continue to do so. And what you also said, Sayce, is I know is shared by many that I've spoken to and my colleagues about the fears of parents at the moment, because I've also heard about and experienced myself that certain communities, specifically Black and Asian people, or Black and Brown as people also have said, experience the police force rather than the police service. And that's why I think there's a slight disconnect from some that may be watching, where they can't relate to, you know, every time they've had an experience with the police, it's been completely positive and they can't understand why things escalate so quickly. I think it's important to take a two-pronged approach, be polite, know your rights, and be able to push back, you know, legally, you know, very strongly should lines be crossed. And we've just heard how they are crossed far too regularly. So I think everyone should be encouraged that there is a new dawn, and we're entering a new era where certainly Legal Lifelines and with our colleagues are joining together to bring you the empowerment community to know your rights and to push back should you need to, by apps like Wise Stop and their complaints procedure, and the Legal Lifelines app, which I'm about to explain to you, which essentially, in fact, I'm going to start off with a video which should hopefully be self-explanatory, and then I'll elaborate a little bit more just shortly afterwards. So. Legal Lifelines is incredibly proud and excited to offer this to the community. It's a free app which is available both on the Apple Store and Android. And what it does, I mean, it does all the things that you'd expect a law firm's app to do, and you can keep up to date with articles and webinars such as this, where you can sign up and watch. But crucially, in terms of stop and search, when you think that there's going to be an interaction with those in authority, you can press the SOS feature. And what that will do is start a live stream, a little bit like what Sayce did in order to protect himself and document his ordeal. But crucially, that live stream is kept on a separate server. So should the phone be damaged, destroyed, or confiscated, that footage can be immediately accessible to the individual who had protected themselves and downloaded the app. and that footage can be used however they so wish, through, you know, legal Lifelines or other charities or solicitors that can analyze that footage and fully advise them on whether or not their rights were violated and take the appropriate action. Equally, if you are under threat of arrest or being arrested, at the touch of a button, you can immediately get access to top-end legal advice. And I not that I want to you know, big up the firm, but we work with, you know, the leaders, the market leaders, as you can see from the panel that we're producing for you. And we've got a team that are motivated and knowledgeable. And if you push that button, you will get through to somebody that will be able to advise you from the word go. Because a lot of problems that caused at the police, you know, in initial interactions with police, when people don't know their rights and they say the wrong things or act in the wrong way, and it causes real problems later. And I know that Abby and Joe, no doubt, have got experience of having severe difficulties getting hold of the police body-worn footage, and that's even if they've even activated it. So this app's intended to protect those who have it. It's not intended to inflame things with the police, but as police advocate the use of body-worn cameras, it's just a body-worn, well, a handheld camera that essentially will protect those, because it will deter overzealous policing. And any police officer that interacts with an individual with this app will know that they've got very formidable legal advice on speed dial. And so I hope the combination of the frontline work that Sayce and Dorris are doing in trying to change people's perceptions and educate the police, and the frontline work of Joe and Abby in fighting injustices when they get highlighted, and also Dr. Rita's incredible work of trying to just change the whole, you know, tidy up the law and highlight where things are going so wrong. But and I think just on finishing up, because I appreciate there's an eager audience waiting to ask the panel questions. One more thing that I think is worth mentioning is we keep hearing this myth that Black people are responsible for all the crime and you know, that's why they get stopped more. If you're stopped 10 times more often than any other ethnicity, then you know you're 10 times more likely to find something wrong with yourself or your vehicle, because you know we're human and people do make mistakes. And equally, if you're stopped 10 times more often, you're less likely to be, you know, watching your P's and Q's if that's the 4th time in a week that you've been stopped trying to get to work, or you know you've been, as Sayce mentioned, trying to do the right thing and support the community amidst the pandemic, and getting stopped going about his lawful business. And by the way, Sayce, my condolences for your losses that you mentioned. But look, community, you've heard from our panel, and I'm so grateful to you again for giving up your time. And community, I'm so glad that you've given up your time to listen to us and hopefully learn. And now's the time when I'm going to, in a few moments, go and have a look at the questions that I know have been flooding in throughout this webinar. But before I do that, there's just one more video I want to show you, which just encapsulates what Legal Lifelines is about, and what I hope that you've seen delivered in this webinar, which is combining the best in our community and giving back to the community.
The virus has been declared a pandemic. It is out of control. The virus I'm referring to is called racism.
We must be mad. Literally mad.
In what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom.
You can no longer sit back and remain silent.
Please. I can't breathe on this.
We want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings.
Shame on you to be the man.
moment right here.
Now is not the time to be silent.
And remember, the virus we're talking about is racism.
Those of you that can see that, I hope that you do. We need engagement with the community and on behalf of the community to enable us to give back to you. So please do, if you're a frontline charity and you're tuning in, let us know what you need and we will deliver it back to you. And equally, community, tell us what you need, and we're all about giving back in any way we can. And from the panel that you can see, we know the best people in the business, so we will always continue to strive to give back in the best way we can. So I'm going to jump into the Q&A now and see. Here's one from a Mr. Ali, and I'm going to direct it in Abby's direction. And it's just, he's asked, which part of the body can officers legally search?
Sure, yeah. I saw another question as well, which I think ties in with that, so I could answer both at the same time. The other question was asking about strip searches and whether or not it was legal for a young person to be strip searched in a police van. So I'll take them both at the same time. So in terms of which parts of your body an officer can search, there's 3 levels of stop and searches. There's the standard one, which is the outer clothing that can be taken off, and that can be done on the side of the street. However, they can, so in terms of outer clothing, let me break that down. That can be done in public, so that could be your coat or jacket, gloves, or an item that conceals your identity. So if we're thinking nowadays, balaclavas, masks that may be being worn and so on. They can put their hands inside your shoes, your socks, or headgear if they believe that something is hidden, and they can also ask you to turn your pockets inside out, or they'll pat those items down. If they want you to remove any other items of clothing, then that's either called a more thorough search, such as, for example, removing a jumper or a t-shirt, or it's called a strip search, which involves the removal of all clothing. So if it's a religious item, for example, if it's a headscarf that you're wearing for religious reasons, that comes under the more thorough search category. That wouldn't count as outer clothing. So a more thorough search can take place in the back of a police van or just somewhere that's out of the public view. However, a strip search can only take place in a police station or in a designated area. So for example, the police tent. You cannot strip search somebody in a police van. So in terms of the question that came from the other participant, if it was a strip search, so in other words, if it was literally stripping down and not just taking off and getting to the more thorough search level, and that took place in a police van, on the face of it, that was not legal. I would seek legal advice around that and get somebody involved and consider making a complaint if that took place. You also said a young person. If you mean somebody who is under the age of 18, well, a strip search, it has to be done out of public view. It has to be conducted by an officer who's of the same sex, without any officer of the opposite sex available to see. And if it's a person who is 17 or under, then a strip search can only take place in the presence of an appropriate adult. Now, an appropriate adult would normally be a parent, legal guardian, but it actually just means anybody who is over the age of 18 and is either trained as an appropriate adult or a trusted person known to the young person. So a social worker, for example. Sometimes there are charities that provide appropriate adults as well. So unless those factors have been added into that strip search scenario, it sounds suspicious to me if it was conducted in a police van. The officer has to provide you with a reason for needing to search further, and it can't be that they've simply not found anything yet. And if you ever feel uncomfortable during a search, you can ask the officer if it can be done with more privacy. And if they don't do that, then they need to note it down in their records, because a stop and search is not meant to be a humiliating experience, which I think is ironic, because I think it always is humiliating. But if you say, specific things about the experience which are making you uncomfortable, and there are reasonable adjustments that the officers can make, then they really should do. So I hope that answers both of your questions.
Thank you very much, Abby. And again, this is the importance of and what we're trying to do with Legal Lifelines is bringing you legal advice, top-end legal advice for the community. So Thank you very much, Abby, and I hope that answers your questions, to echo what Abby said.
Michael, can I just add something to?
Yes, please do,
Abby,
Joe.
because Abby's just given you an extremely thorough understanding of what the different levels of search are, and I hope everyone who's listening is able to take note if they're not aware of those things from before. But one of the things that Abby's alluding to in terms of how you deal with a situation that has gone wrong and whether you wish to take action about it, to make a complaint or anything further, something that I'm going to suggest people consider is this. If you find yourself, or you know a member of your family or a friend, being on the receiving end of what appears to be an unlawful search, or a search that is not in compliance with the way in which these things ought to be done, you need to make a record of that yourself as soon as you possibly can, whilst that search is still fresh in your mind. You may be hurting, you may be upset, you may feel humiliated, but one of the important ways for a human being to deal with being treated badly is to feel that they can regain some power over that situation. And in the aftermath of a search of that type, what I would suggest is go into your phone or go home onto your computer, to your laptop, and type out an email to yourself. And in that email, write down what happened and then hit the send button. Because then you have an email that has the date and the time of when you entered that information on it. And it's something that then becomes available as a statement that you are making about your experience that you can then share with a lawyer potentially, or indeed if it goes to court. And what that does is it stops later on the other side, that's to say the police officer who's in fact breached your rights, being able to claim that you made up a story a couple of days later just because you were feeling a bit annoyed about what had happened. It's what we call effectively a contemporaneous record. It's something that the police are meant to do themselves when they keep a note of what had happened and they get a timestamp on their evidence report book. What we should be doing as citizens is ensuring that we have an equality of power as far as we can by making sure we keep records ourselves that we can refer to later on. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, Joe, actually that feeds into a question that we've got from Zhao Pan that I'd seen, where they asked about what we could do. They said, when we see a stop and search being performed in public, what can we legally do to help the person being searched? If the police are crossing the line, what can we do to stop them or hold them accountable? And I've made some notes, which is very much in line with what Joe has just said. And I've said, watch from a safe distance, film if you can, take down the name, station, badge numbers of the officers. If it's someone that you know, call the responsible person and inform them what's happened so they can be ready to attend a police station or attend the scene, particularly because police officers do not need to inform the parents or legal guardians of a youth if they are stopping and searching them. So if you're seeing somebody who is under the age of 18 being stopped and searched, and you know their parents, then you can take that step to call the parents and try to get them to attend the scene or the police station as soon as possible. We've mentioned apps such as the Legal Lifelines app and the Y-Stop app, but also if you can't film for whatever reason, as Joe has said, writing that down or making a voice note of what happened so that you have a best memory record of it is always really helpful, especially because, and it's something that Sayce touched upon, I remember starting out as a pupil in the magistrates court, and pretty much every assault PC case that I had, the issue was the defendant arguing that in fact they had been assaulted by that police officer, or that police officer had done something out of line, and they felt that the assault PC charge arose out of the indignation that had been demonstrated by the person who'd been stopped, and it was almost a preemptive measure that was being used by that police officer to dissuade any complaint being made. So like Joe said, if you actually have a record of what has happened at that time before that person is then arrested for an assault PC, that could really help that person later on, because you never know what may come out of the stop and search.
Just following on from what Joe and yourself have said, and some of the questions that I can see popping up which relate to what do you do if the police take your phone away, or what if the police stop you taking your phone out. If you take preemptive action and you activate the app, One feature that I didn't mention is that you put in a unique PIN when you download the app, which you need to put in that PIN to stop the phone recording. So it's a very good way of recording what happens. If they make you put it in the police make you put your phone away, then it's still keeping an audio record, which can't be switched off by anyone else other than the user. So that will help both the people, and there's someone else, Mr. Caldon is mentioning, what if you don't have enough evidence? Well, look, ultimately, if you don't have enough evidence, it's very hard to make any progress whatsoever. So what this app will do is hopefully neutralize situations that could get out of hand by dissuading the police from acting inappropriately, and equally the user will be less likely to potentially be aggressive if they were going to be aggressive, because it's all being filmed. So we hope that that will de-escalate things, but that if things do get out of hand, there will be a pretty good record of what happened, which can't be destroyed by anyone that would want to destroy it other than the user. So I hope that assists. We've got a question here saying, well, actually, I'm going to combine it like you did earlier, Abby. And the first one is asking, can the police take your fingerprints during a stop and search? And the second is, will being stopped and searched give you a criminal record? And again, Abby, I'm going to ask you to address that. Thank you.
They won't be able to take your fingerprints while being stopped and searched. Just to be clear, stop and search is what happens basically on the roadside. Taking fingerprints, DNA samples and so on would normally happen in a custody suite. The advantage of a custody suite as well is that there's always CCTV in the custody suite, which has audio, so it would record the reasons that the police officer has given for taking any samples of DNA, fingerprints and so on. And the second part, which was whether or not a stop and search in and of itself causes you to have a record, no it doesn't. And in fact, I mean, this is one of the issues that Rita, Dorris and Sayce have all touched upon. That's another reason why for years and years, actually, the data around stop and search was so difficult to gather, because ironically, if you had a police record, from a stop and search, if you had a criminal conviction or any sort of record from stop and search, we'd have had the data from the outset. But no, stop and search does not give you a criminal record, because it's simply them, it's just the act of them doing so. That's why getting the receipt and so on is important, but it's also another reason to keep in mind that it's humiliating, but it's not something which is going to work against you in future, in theory. What I would point out, however, is that I have seen the police, and Joe, I'm sure you've seen this as well, in murder cases, in really serious cases, where the mere fact that somebody has been stopped and searched repeatedly in a certain area then gets created as though it's police intelligence about that person, and creates a background of suspicion about that person, and is sometimes used off the back of that for bad character applications in court. Very often, though, if you have a reasonable prosecutor, they would never touch that, but it can be used in bad character applications in court. It can be used for criminal behaviour orders or its predecessor antisocial behaviour orders, even if they don't amount to anything at all. That's why it's really important to keep those records for yourself, because you never know what's being done with that in future, what may come up out of it. But they are not supposed to keep those as negative records against you. You can ask for a disclosure of those under the Data Protection Act and Freedom of Information Act. But the fact is that it has made its way onto things like the gangs matrix, which we could do a whole other webinar about. I don't know if, Dorris, if you wanted to jump in about that in terms of the way that it's used by police officers sometimes, or Rita as well.
Sometimes, you know, when the records are created, you can see a long list of stops against a certain person's name, and they haven't necessarily amounted to anything. So when gathering intelligence against a person, all these things are used. But I have heard it said, if I can just go back to the question of complaints, I have had it said to me that, oh, what's the point of complaining, because it's long and you lot stick together anyway, so there's no reason why I should complain. And I would say that there really is a reason to complain, because, you know, how are we going to make a change if there are no complaints? It might be that, you know, a particular officer has got a lot of bad character, or has got 2 strikes against him. So that 3rd strike coming in may lead to disciplinary action or even dismissal. So it absolutely is worth complaining and getting the bad officers off the streets.
Absolutely, absolutely right. And actually, just if anyone's interest was sparked by what Abby mentioned about the gangs matrix, there's a fascinating article written by a brilliant barrister, Cheryl Nwosu, which is on the Legal Lifelines articles page. And I encourage you to have a read, and it will shed some light about the false intelligence, or the false intelligence that actually perpetuates incorrectly held, even though it's in perhaps good faith, if the police officers believe their own incorrect intelligence, that black people are leaders in crime. And I think that's probably a big reason why we do see these completely disproportionate and wrong figures of stop and search amongst the community. Another question here, and yes, there's other people asking for a gangs matrix webinar, so let's get that in the diary, but I know we're running out of time. Aisha's asked the panel, and I'll throw it open to the panel, do we think that stop and search should be taught in schools? And I suppose that may be a rhetorical question, because actually it's so important that education and empowerment is so important. Is that something maybe, Sayce and Dorris, that you might use your community contacts with schools to try and bring lawyers into schools to is that possible?
But there is already certain things going on within schools where police officers go in schools, and stop and search will be part of the program that they're teaching. I think it's PSHI or something like that, on the program where police officers go in and they talk about crime and safety issues. Stop and search does come into it. It's not all schools, and unfortunately, when money is tight, they want to get rid of programs. These are the first things that they get rid of, because it's important that we go into primary schools and secondary schools and teach these things. But for some reason, senior officers don't seem to think that it is important. Rather than preventing or using preventative measures, they trying to contain situations. So it does happen, not that effectively, but it is something that is being done.
Good. And I'll just throw a follow-on from that does the panel think there's an issue, or what does the community think? Perhaps you can quickly get on speed dial in the Q&A about stop and search being taught by police officers. And do you think there's scope for more lawyers and barristers to come into schools to actually educate people on their rights? Yeah. Because I know that there's a lot of mistrust in the community because of their disproportionate negative experiences of police, often in stop and search situations.
So yeah, I mean, just to expand on what you said about education, I think it's how we approach it and who delivers it. If you're having police officers delivering it in schools, children are going to switch off. Children are not really going to want to engage. It's got to be from trusted professionals within the school environment and people that look like the people that are being stopped and searched. I mean, now because of the work that I'm doing, young people are coming to me in their droves asking, well, what shall I do with this, or what shall I do with that, sending me their videos. And I think it's got to be a kind of coordinated effort between kind of community leaders and organizations and charities that are doing the work with young people, and with the professionals, the lawyers and the barristers. And I think it's worthwhile looking at something that we can do, online, because I think that, with what's going on with COVID, getting to schools is very difficult. And that's what we're finding at the moment with Mentivity. But it's definitely worthwhile having something like this geared towards young people, where they can understand it from their perspective and their standpoint. And I think that's important, just breaking it down in a way that they understand. And it has to start from as young as 8, 9, 10, because you need to have that confidence. So when it does happen, with my son, for example, I know it's going to happen. So I keep talking to him about it. I keep, kind of drilling it into his head that when it does come, that this is how you've got to be. And even during like kind of dry run-throughs, it's very important that we do the kind of role playing and stuff as well, because when they get to that situation, they're going to freeze. Just like you said with the barrister that got stopped, he couldn't even recall what he should be doing, and he's trained. So that's what the issue that we face, and that young people now are being treated in such a way, you know, that they're not children, and they're being treated as adults by these police officers that have their own agenda and want to criminalise young people. So we've got to prepare them for that.
There's no lower limit on the age of the person being stopped and searched. So like Sayce touched upon, another reason to start those conversations when they're 8, 9 or 10 is that it can happen when they're 8, 9 or 10. And it needs to be an environment where parents can join in as well, because I think even just navigating those conversations would be really difficult. And if a child attends a webinar like this or starts speaking about this topic and they go home and that message isn't reinforced by their parents, you know, that would be really difficult too. They need to have that follow-up with their parents. Doris, you were unmuted. I'm sorry, I spoke at the same time as you.
No, no, don't apologise. I was just going to add to what Sayce said, because I have been a schools officer, and I've been in from nursery age, obviously not doing stop and search, but, you know, getting the little ones used to police officers and the uniform and the work that we do. So that's just sort of like a gentle approach. But I do agree that it should be other professions going in, but I think certainly at secondary school age, because when I'm going into secondary schools, there is a hostility there because I'm wearing the uniform, and it's the uniform that they see first. And all their impressions of police officers are negative ones, well, most of them anyway. So, you know, I was fighting and I was, you know, running uphill when I went into secondary schools. It's not to say I wasn't effective. I think I was in some areas, but the majority of the positive work that I did was in primary schools. But I do agree that other professions should go in as well.
Brilliant. Well, look, panel, I'm quite aware that we've slightly run over, but I think that's just because everyone's just been so engaged. Certainly I have. And I'd just like to thank you all on behalf of the community, and certainly Legal Lifelines, for giving up again a good amount of time on your Saturday, as well as the preparation that I know you've clearly put in because of your amazing contributions to this panel. And community, I hope you've benefited from the insights that you've heard from all our contributors today. And I'm also seeing a lot of some people putting their hands up to say, how can they get involved? Well, I would invite you to go and visit the Legal Lifelines webpage at www.legallifelines.co.uk, where we do have a frontline charities and organisations page, which, you know, again, you've seen the amazing or heard about the amazing work that Sayce and Dorris are doing. Get involved with them, get in touch. I know there's a lot of will out there to do good, but people don't know where to give their time, effort, and, dare I say it, money. So feel free to get, you know, volunteer. And if Sayce or Dorris, they need people, I'm sure they do, then they'll put your talents to good use, because I know there's so much talent out there in the community. Equally, if you don't see what you want in that list, then please nominate people so that we can push the community back into the spaces where they're going to benefit most from the talent that's out there. So look, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much again, both the panel and the community, and keep looking out for our social media for the next webinar that will be announced very shortly. And I'm sure there's going to be an equally brilliant panel, and perhaps some of the panelists would join Legal Lifelines again, because it's been a real pleasure from me. So thank you very much again.